This is part 4 of the Kingdom Protista lectures, and this is where we left off is with the Oomycetes. The Oomycetes are definitely protozoans, even though they can look hairy and just real similar to some mold and mildew that are in the kingdom fungi. Many of the Oomycetes are saprobes, but some are parasites. And one that you're going to see near the end of this slideshow is a parasite of potatoes, and it causes potato blight. It is Phytophthora infestans is the scientific name of it. So that's an example of an Oomycetes. What you're looking at here is a water mold. So many Oomycetes are water molds. They are not in the kingdom fungi because their structure is not closely related to a fungus, as closely related to a fungus as it should be. And another thing is that they have a cellulose cell wall like plants. So their cell wall is composed of cellulose. A fungal cell walls are composed of chitin, which is a different chemical. They're both polysaccharides, but chitin and cellulose are totally different. Cellulose is associated with plants. So, and then we have the Rhizaria. So we're moving on to the Rhizaria. The Rhizaria includes organisms that have pseudopods or pseudopodia, but they're needle-like or thread-like. If you remember the picture of the amoeba earlier, well, maybe it won't take that long to get back to it. There we go. Okay, you see how the amoeba, this is what a pseudopod looks like. It's kind of almost like fleshy, thicker, but the pseudopods in the Rhizaria, they can either be radiolarians or foraminiferans. Those pseudopods are more thread-like or needle-like, but they still move by cytoplasmic streaming through the pseudopods. They still move like an amoeba moves. All right, so one subgroup of the Rhizaria are foraminiferans. Foraminiferans have a shell called a test that is composed of calcium carbonate. Now, calcium carbonate is found in chalk, it is found in bone, it's found in rocks. But the pseudopods extend through the pores of the test. All right, radiolarians are another subgroup of Rhizaria, and they're another type that has a glassy shell, but it's totally different looking than the diatoms. They have needle-like pseudopods. They're not easy to see in this picture, but they do have pseudopods just like any other member of the Rhizaria. Now, the Archaeoplastida also include plants. So land plants are a member of this supergroup, and the other members are red algae and green algae. There's two groups of green algae and one group of red algae. They can be unicellular, they can be multicellular, and they can also be colonial. Red algae I think we talked about brown algae as most of your seaweed is brown algae, but it can be red algae too. Seaweed is typically just multicellular algae, large algae. but that red algae can be seaweed and brown algae can be seaweed. The red color comes from some accessory pigments, photosynthetic pigments called phycoerythrins. Erythro means red. Okay. And there are some red algae that are parasites. The green algae are grouped into the chlorophytes and the charophytes, whereas I don't think I said this, the red algae are the rhodophytes. So green algae are either chlorophytes or charophytes, and the charophytes are the closest living relatives to land plants. All right, for the chlorophytes, some of the unicellular chlorophytes are a common component of plankton. Chlamydomonas is a unicellular chlorophyte. There is a multicellular chlorophyte called sea lettuce, and it kind of does look like a little bit like lettuce. And there's also colonial chlorophytes called volvox. Volvox are really cool looking. This is under a lower power, and this is volvox under a higher power. Um, but they are algal cells that live together in colonies from 500 to 60,000 cells in the colony. And those cells do have two flagella each. And then another chlorophyte is your caulerpa, which is just another multicellular algae. And it doesn't have any pictures of charophytes, but charophytes are another group of green algae that are included in the Archaeoplastida. And then we're going to move on to the supergroup amoebozoans. The amoebozoans have pseudopods, but they're different from the Rosaria because they're not like needles or hair. They're not so thin. They're thicker, more fleshy looking. So what's grouped in with the amoebozoans are the plasmodial and cellular slime molds. And then the organisms that we just call amoeba. Okay. Here is a life cycle for the plasmodial slime mold, but instead of focusing on that a whole lot, I just want you to see what it actually looks like. There's a picture down at the bottom right that shows you what plasmodial slime mold looks like. And this is cellular slime mold. And we've already seen a picture of an amoeba, so I'm not going to go back to that, but the amoebas are unicellular, and they do have pseudopods. They move by cytoplasmic streaming. And I believe this is our last supergroup in our slideshow, the epistoconts or the epistoconta. Probably the best example in this group are the choanoflagellates. But fungi and animals are in this supergroup as well. So animals and, it doesn't say it, but the epistoconts contains the animals, fungi, which lets you know that a fungus is more closely related to an animal than it is to a plant. So animals, fungi, and then these choanoflagellates. These are the members of the supergroup Epistoconts, and we're really more concerned with the choanoflagellates. These do have flagella, and they resemble some cells called choanocytes that you find in the animal, the sponge, that you find lining the inside of the sponge. So it is thought that maybe sponges, since they're the simplest of all animals, evolved from a choanoflagellate ancestor. Okay. So some of the roles that Protista have in the world, we've talked about many examples of protozoans that are part of the plankton in fresh water and in the ocean. Um, the protists that are known as primary producers, that means they're going to carry out photosynthesis, are the dinoflagellates, the diatoms, and the multicellular algae. And there are more examples. Any of the algae, any algae, whether it's unicellular, multicellular, colonial, is going to be a primary producer. Um, and Euglena would fall into that because Euglena can carry out photosynthesis. So any of your protists that carry out photosynthesis. Um, this is an example of a photosynthetic protist that lives symbiotically with coral. Um, So these photosynthetic protists that you're seeing are dinoflagellates called zooxanthellae, and they carry out photosynthesis and make their own food, and they live in a symbiotic relationship with coral polyps. And coral is an animal, so a coral is, in fact, is related to a sea anemone. It is the animal that secretes the coral shells, the coral formations that you see in the coral reefs, the underwater coral reefs in the around the equator. But they have many tropical fish and things like that. Um, the coral reef, for example, is I think everybody can relate to Finding Nemo, so that's the habitat in Finding Nemo. But these animals are called corals, and the dinoflagellates live symbiotically with them, and they provide nutrients to the coral animal. Some of the protista are decomposers. We talked about there's some of them called saprobes, live off of dead organic material or even the waste of living things. Um, so this kind of helps to get rid of a lot of the dead organic material, so that our earth is not consumed with all of that dead decomposing leftover bodies, you know. So slime molds, we talked about, they can be water molds like the oomycetes, I'm trying to think of the word, and they can be plasmodial or cellular slime molds. This is a picture of a slime mold that lives on, in the grass. This is a picture of one I already went over with you, Plasmodium, and I wrote it out in the slide. Plasmodium falciparum, which is the protozoan that causes malaria. Now, what you're seeing is all of these kind of gray round structures are red blood cells, and then this is the protozoan. So this is a sample of, it's a blood smear of some blood that is infected with the Plasmodium falciparum. And this particular Plasmodium falciparum, this particular species, causes 50% of all malaria cases. And it's the one that's the most fatal. It's responsible for the most fatalities. African sleeping sickness, Trypanosoma brucei, remember, is a euglena, which is in the supergroup excavata, but that's what the trypanosoma looks like. These are red blood cells, the little red round, they're red blood cells. They look gray on this slide, but they're stained differently, and so you can see that they're red in this slide. But the trypanosoma causes African sleeping sickness. And then we have some plant parasites that are protist. You can see these leaves that are affected with mildew. And then Phytophthora infestans.